Welcome to Reform Thinking. Usually when we look at historical conflicts, especially these ancient theological ones, there is this massive temptation to view the whole situation like a comic book.
Oh, for sure. We really prefer our history with clean labels.
Yeah, we do. You have the hero standing on one side, and on the other side, you have this, solid block of faceless antagonists. The narrative is kept super clean. It is totally binary.
Right, the hero holds all the correct ideas, and the opponents are, characterized as stubborn or unreasonable.
Or just completely lacking any logical rationale for what they are doing. And we project our own modern battles onto the past, assigning the role of the bad guys to whoever represents the current ideology we happen to be fighting against today.
It makes the narrative so much easier to digest, when we do not have to consider the opposing viewpoint sympathetically at all.
Right.
And for centuries, readers of the Apostle Paul's letters, whether we are talking about the early church theologians, the reformers in the 16th century, or even modern academic scholars, they have tended to read Paul's opponents as this generic foil.
They're basically a blank slate for our own theological anxieties.
Spot on. Those opponents get dressed up in the conceptual clothes of whatever foe the reader happens to be battling.
Yeah.
So, if you were reading Paul during a conflict over church hierarchy, his opponents suddenly look like these rigid institutionalists.
Or if you're reading him during a debate over grace, the opponents are characterized as mean-spirited legalists trying to earn their salvation through sheer effort.
Yeah, that is a very common one. But then, you step into the actual historical world of the first century Mediterranean.
Specifically the world of Paul and his letters.
Right, and suddenly that tidy comic book narrative just shatters entirely.
It really does, which is why I am so thrilled you are joining us for today's deep dive. We are going to look into a fascinating body of source material today, specifically Matthew Thiessen's chapter, Paul and the Gentile Problem.
It is such a brilliant piece of scholarship.
It is, and our mission for this deep dive, for you listening right now, is to look at how first century Judaism actually viewed outsiders, specifically the Gentile nations. And we want to see how understanding these incredibly diverse, intellectually rigorous viewpoints completely rewrites our understanding of Paul.
And it rewrites our understanding of the very real people he was arguing against, too.
Yeah, because Thiessen pushes back heavily against those traditional scholarly assumptions we just mentioned.
He really does. He argues that if we want to understand what was actually happening in places like Galatia or Rome, we have to drop the caricatures. We have to look at the historical reality with clear eyes.
Which means acknowledging that Jewish thinkers in the Second Temple period were absolutely not a monolith.
Not at all. They held at least 5 distinct, well-reasoned, and scripturally backed solutions for how Gentiles could relate to Israel's God.
5 solutions, not just one strict rule.
Right. They were not just making up arbitrary rules to keep outsiders away. They were, wrestling with ancient texts to figure out the actual mechanisms of divine interaction with the non-Jewish world.
I think the common misconception shared by many listeners is that early Judaism maintained a single, highly rigid view of outsiders. Like, you either had to undergo full physical conversion and become Jewish, or you were entirely cut off from the covenant and left to your own devices.
Yeah, the all-or-nothing view.
But before we can even begin to understand Paul's specific arguments in his letters, we need to map out the actual options available to a first-century thinker looking at the surrounding Greco-Roman world.
Which is what makes Thiessen's breakdown so helpful.
I like to think of these solutions kind of like modern immigration or residency policies. So you have some policies that allow temporary visitation, some offer permanent residency without the right to vote.
Sure.
Some provide a rigorous path to full naturalized citizenship, and then some just lock down the borders completely.
That is a really helpful analogy for this. So the first solution Thiessen outlines, and he is drawing on the work of scholar Terence Donaldson here, is what we call sympathization.
Sympathization. Okay.
Yeah, this is basically the category for the respectful outsider. These were Gentiles who respected the God of Israel, they respected the ancestral laws or honored the Jerusalem temple, but they did not adopt Jewish practices in their daily lives.
So they are not keeping kosher or resting on the Sabbath.
Right. And they certainly did not identify themselves as part of the Jewish ethnic group. They maintain their Gentile identity completely.
I'm looking at the historical sources here, and it is fascinating who actually falls into this category. You have foreign kings and emperors providing vast financial support for the Jerusalem temple.
Oh, the financial records are amazing.
Like, the Book of Ezra details Cyrus the Great funding the rebuilding of the temple. The historian Josephus mentions Xerxes and Antiochus Eusebius, and the author of Second Maccabees talks about Seleucus providing funds for the sacrificial services.
Even Roman emperors got involved. Philo records that Caesar Augustus himself arranged for regular offerings to be made at the temple.
But, let's apply some historical friction here for a second. When Augustus funds a temple sacrifice in Jerusalem, it feels less like a genuine theological awakening and more like a modern politician showing up to a local cultural festival to eat a corn dog and shake hands.
Yeah, a photo op.
Right. It is good optics. It keeps the local population pacified.
Well, that political cynicism was certainly a major factor for the ruling class. I mean, the Roman Empire managed a massive array of diverse cultures, and keeping the local deities appeased was just standard administrative protocol.
Just keeping the peace.
Yeah. But the sources suggest this phenomenon went far beyond calculated political maneuvering. Consider the letter of Aristeas, which depicts the Egyptian king Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, honoring the Jewish law.
What does that text say about him?
The text portrays him giving thanks to the God who pronounced those oracles, recognizing a supreme divine authority behind the texts. And Philo claims Ptolemy's desire to translate the Jewish law into Greek, which eventually became the Septuagint, was a result of his sincere zeal and intellectual longing for the wisdom contained in it.
Okay, so a real intellectual respect.
Yes. Philo also writes about Petronius, who was the Roman governor of Syria under Emperor Gaius. Philo claims Petronius harbored a genuine respect for Jewish philosophy and piety.
And we also have Roman writers corroborating this from the outside, which I think adds immense credibility. Because it wasn't just Jewish authors bragging about how much the Gentiles liked their laws.
No, the Romans were actually complaining about it.
Right. The Roman philosopher Seneca famously complained about how widespread this Gentile attraction to Jewish customs had become.
What did he say specifically?
He lamented that the customs of this accursed race, his words, obviously had gained such influence that they were now accepted throughout all the lands.
Wow.
When a Roman Stoic complains about the popularity of a foreign philosophical system among his own people, you are looking at a massive grassroots movement. These sympathizers did not abandon their ancestral gods or their Roman identity, but they integrated a deep respect for the God of Israel into their worldview.
Which brings us to the second framework. This one is slightly more structured. Ethical monotheism.
Ethical monotheism.
Right. This pattern builds on the sympathizer model, but introduces a highly specific theological mechanism.
Let me push back on how that mechanism functions for a second, because ethical monotheism creates an immediate theological puzzle to me.
How so?
Well, if the Mosaic law given at Sinai is the absolute standard of righteousness, how could a Gentile in the ancient world be considered righteous by a Jewish thinker without knowing a single thing about dietary restrictions, Sabbath keeping, or ritual purity?
That is the big question. And the mechanism relies on a two-tiered understanding of divine legislation.
Two-tiered?
Yeah. Some Jewish thinkers believe that God issued a separate universal law to all of humanity, completely distinct from the highly specific Mosaic law given at Sinai.
Oh, interesting.
This universal moral code is frequently associated with the Noahide law, because Noah is the ancestor of all humanity after the flood. Not just the Israelites. Commands given to him apply to every nation on earth.
This solves the theological puzzle perfectly. Within this framework, God intended all of humanity to observe this universal baseline, while he intended only the people of Israel to observe the much more extensive, rigorous Mosaic covenant.
Spot on. And the Book of Jubilees outlines this beautifully. It depicts Noah commanding his sons to follow some very basic rules.
What were the rules?
They must bless the Creator, which establishes a baseline of monotheism. They must do justice, honor their parents, love their neighbors, and abstain from sexual immorality and ritual pollution.
So it is a very streamlined moral code. There are no dietary restrictions prohibiting pork or shellfish, no demands for Sabbath rest, and no requirement for physical circumcision.
Right. It is basically basic human decency, coupled with the recognition of one supreme maker. Philo relied heavily on this concept. He asserts that all Greeks and barbarians unanimously acknowledge the existence of the supreme Father of gods and men, the maker of the whole universe.
And we see this in other texts too, right?
Yeah, the Sibylline Oracles, which is a collection of ancient texts, expect Gentiles to abandon the worship of idols and live morally by not oppressing others, avoiding sexual immorality, and refusing to kill their children.
Which was a very common practice in the Roman world, sadly.
It was. So the Jews whose thinking fixed this ethical monotheism pattern believe that Gentiles can remain entirely outside the covenant of Moses, living as Gentiles, and still be perfectly pleasing to God by following this universal baseline.
But, that creates a massive theological deficit in another area.
What do you mean?
If God intends to restore the whole world, having the nations just doing the bare minimum Noahide laws feels incomplete. The prophets talk about a total cosmic restoration. That tension has to lead somewhere else.
You are identifying the exact friction that birthed the third solution, eschatological participation.
Okay, eschatological participation. Break that down for us.
This is the belief that the Gentile problem, the reality of widespread idolatry and rebellion among the nations, cannot be solved by human effort or partial moral codes in the present age.
So the Noahide laws aren't enough.
Right. Instead, it requires a direct, miraculous intervention by God at the end of days.
The end times fix. Human solutions are insufficient, so we wait for divine action.
Precisely. You see this heavily in the prophets, particularly in Deutero-Isaiah. There's this grand, sweeping vision of Israel's eschatological restoration. And when that restoration happens, the Gentiles will stream to Jerusalem.
Right. Isaiah says, Gentiles who have not known you will call upon you, and peoples who have not known you will flee to you.
Yes. And the book of Tobit prophesies that when God rebuilds Jerusalem, the Gentiles will genuinely turn to fear the Lord God and bury their idols in the earth.
But the internal debate regarding what that actually looks like on the ground is fierce, isn't it? When those Gentiles stream to Jerusalem, do they adopt the Mosaic law? Do they undergo physical conversion to become Jewish?
That is the dividing line. Some authors did envision Gentiles adopting the entirety of the Jewish law at the eschaton. Isaiah 2 pictures the nations coming to the mountain of the Lord specifically to undergo instruction in the law.
Right.
Philo anticipates Gentiles abandoning their own ancestral customs entirely and honoring Jewish laws alone during the restoration. However, other authors perceived this eschatological salvation through a completely different lens.
How so?
They envision an influx of Gentiles who worship the one true God, but who do so strictly as Gentiles.
I want to spend some time on the analogy Thiessen brings up from the animal apocalypse found in 1 Enoch, because the visual imagery here explains the theology better than 100 pages of academic prose.
Oh, the animal apocalypse is brilliant.
In this apocalyptic vision, humanity is depicted as different kinds of animals. The people of Israel are depicted as sheep, which are clean animals, acceptable for sacrifice, docile, and part of the flock.
Right.
And the Gentile nations are depicted as various unclean animals, wild predators like wolves, lions, and boars.
It is a striking use of apocalyptic imagery to demonstrate a fundamental ontological difference between the groups. You have the protected flock, and you have the chaotic, predatory wilderness outside.
Yeah. And at the end of days, God steps in and miraculously purifies the wild, unclean animals. The wolves and lions are changed into clean white bulls.
Okay, yes.
But the crucial detail, the part that completely reorients how we understand this theology, is that they become bulls. They do not become sheep.
That is the key.
They undergo this incredible divine purification to become clean, acceptable animals. They are no longer predatory. They no longer represent a threat, but they remain a distinct biological category from the sheep.
This illustrates a point made by scholar Paula Fredrickson, which Thiessen heavily relies on. She argues that modern interpreters routinely make a category error by assuming eschatological inclusion automatically means eschatological conversion.
Wow, that is a huge distinction.
It is. In the framework of the animal apocalypse, saved Gentiles are not Jews. They are Gentiles who simply no longer worship idols. They are purified, clean neighbors. They are white bulls, not sheep. God values the distinction between the groups and maintains it even after purifying the world.
That distinction is going to be incredibly vital when we start talking about Paul's theological crisis later. But what if someone in the ancient world did not want to wait for the end of time? What if a Gentile encountered the God of Israel and wanted full, unrestricted access to the covenant right now? That brings us to the fourth solution. Conversion.
Yeah, of the 5 patterns we were discussing, conversion is the only solution where a Gentile actually ceases to be a Gentile.
Their prior identity is erased.
Entirely. They undergo physical circumcision, they take on the full yoke of the Mosaic law, and they are fully incorporated into the Jewish people.
They change their nationality. They go from being a resident alien or a friendly neighbor to holding a fully naturalized passport.
We see this mechanism vividly displayed in the book of Judith with the story of Achior the Ammonite.
What happens with Achior?
After seeing God's miraculous deliverance of the Jewish people from the Assyrian army, Achior believes in God with all his heart. The text says he circumcises the flesh of his foreskin and joins the house of Israel, remaining there to this day.
Achior's story is fascinating because it highlights a right, yet the narrative in Judith shows Achior the Ammonite being fully incorporated through the rite of circumcision anyway.
The ritual of circumcision was viewed as potent enough to override ancient ethnic prohibitions. We also have historical records of the Hasmonean dynasty in the 2nd century BCE enforcing this.
Right, the political side of things.
Yes. As the Hasmoneans expanded their territory, they incorporated neighboring groups like the Idumeans and Etrurians into the Jewish community via mandatory circumcision. If you wanted to live within the expanded borders of Judea, you had to become a Jew. Geopolitics and border security drove a massive wave of theological conversion.
But not every Jewish thinker would have celebrated the Hasmoneans doing that. The idea of taking a foreign population and simply cutting their flesh to make them part of the covenant would have horrified certain groups.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to the fifth and final solution to the Gentile problem. This one is the hard line. The borders are closed and the locks are changed.
The fifth solution is exclusion. This is the belief that Gentiles simply cannot relate positively to Israel's God under any circumstances because of a permanent, irremediable genealogical difference.
You see this perspective dominate the biblical books of Ezra and Nehemiah. When the exiles return to Jerusalem from Babylon, Ezra discovers that some of the Jewish men have married foreign women from the surrounding nations.
And his reaction is intense.
Ezra's reaction is absolute devastation. He commands the immediate expulsion of all foreign wives and the children born to them. There is no nuance.
None.
There is no discussion about whether these foreign women might want to worship Yahweh, or whether they could be taught the Mosaic law, or whether they could undergo some purification ritual. The underlying assumption is that Gentiles can never, under any circumstances, become part of the community.
And the logic driving this extreme exclusion is tied directly to the concept of holy seed.
Holy seed. Let's unpack that.
Ezra refers to the people of Israel as the holy seed. The inevitable implication is that the surrounding nations are considered profane seed. The mechanics of this are heavily agricultural.
Right. These are farming communities.
Yes, ancient farming communities understood that a bad crop meant starvation. The book of Leviticus contains a strict command. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed. To those who held this exclusivist view, mixing holy and profane human seed through intermarriage was not just a social indiscretion, it was cosmological vandalism.
Cosmological vandalism. I like that phrasing.
It was defying the physical boundaries established by God at creation.
It is the sheer dread of corrupting the harvest. The Book of Jubilees reinforces this exact dread. It uses the story of the slaughter of the Shechemites in Genesis 34 to establish a rigid legal precedent forbidding Jewish fathers from giving their daughters to Gentile men.
Because it defiles the seed.
Yes, Jubilees claims that such a union defiles the holy seed of Jacob. We even have an ancient text from the Dead Sea Scrolls called 4QMMT that appears to condemn intermarriage between Jews and converted Gentiles.
Wait, really? Converted Gentiles?
Yes. This suggests that in the minds of the exclusivists, even a rigorous purification ritual like circumcision cannot change a person's fundamental, profane biological nature.
If you hold to the exclusion framework, a converted Gentile is still just a Gentile. The purification ritual is unlawful, the marriage to them is illicit, and the boundary lines separating the nations are written in the bedrock of creation itself.
So we now have a robust map of the first century mindset. We have sympathization, ethical monotheism, eschatological participation, conversion, and exclusion.
It is quite the spectrum.
It really is. And with this map laid out, we can zoom in on the specific historical conflict happening in Paul's letters, particularly in the region of Galatia. Paul is writing to a group of non-Jewish Christ followers. Some outside teachers have arrived in the community and told these Gentiles, believing in Christ is a good start, but you need to be circumcised. You need to adopt the Mosaic law. Based on our 5 solutions, these teachers are clearly advocating for solution 4, conversion. And to make their case to these Gentiles, they drop the ultimate biblical trump card, Abraham.
Abraham is the perfect scriptural paradigm for their argument. If you want to convince a grown Gentile man that he needs to undergo circumcision to please God, you point directly to the patriarch of the faith.
We need to unpack the backstory of Abraham thoroughly here because you listening might be bringing a lot of chronological assumptions to the text. We read Genesis forward, God calls Abram in chapter 12, and we immediately categorize him as the first Jew.
Right.
But a first century reader is looking at the text differently. To them, Wasn't Abraham basically a Gentile for the vast majority of his life?
Yes, he was a Chaldean, he belonged to the nations, and early Jewish interpreters universally understood that Abraham grew up embedded in a culture of idolatry.
But when you read the book of Genesis, it simply states that God calls Abram out of Ur of the Chaldeans. It does not mention anything about him bowing down to statues or worshiping foreign gods. Where are they getting this background?
They are reading Genesis through the lens of the book of Joshua.
Ah,
In Joshua 24, Joshua gathers the tribes of Israel and reminds them of their history, saying, "Your fathers lived on the other side of the river of old, Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, and they worshipped other gods."
okay, so there is the biblical proof text.
Yes. Now, the Hebrew text uses a specific word for worship, but as scholars point out, there is a fascinating bilingual pun operating in the ancient world here.
A pun?
Yeah. In Hebrew, that word root means to worship or bow down. But in Aramaic, which became the dominant spoken language in the Second Temple period, that exact same word root means to make or to manufacture.
Oh, wow. So when an Aramaic speaker reads the text of Joshua 24, they do not just read that Terah worshipped false gods, they read that Terah manufactured false gods.
Spot on. This linguistic detail birthed a massive tradition of stories found in texts like Jubilees, the Apocalypse of Abraham, and later rabbinic literature like Genesis Rabbah. They depict Terah running a lucrative idol manufacturing business.
That is so interesting.
And Abraham is portrayed as this brilliant, precocious teenager who starts to realize the family business is a complete sham.
I love the story from Genesis Rabbah regarding this. Abraham is left in charge of his father's idol shop for the day. A 50-year-old man walks in to buy an idol. Abraham asks the customer how old he is. The man says he is 50.
Right.
Abraham then mocks him, saying, "You are 50 years old, and you are going to bow down to an object that I carved with my own hands yesterday." Abraham is a terrible salesman because he sees through the entire theological charade. He recognizes the absurdity of assigning divine authority to wood and stone.
It is a very humorous story, but it establishes a highly serious theological baseline. Abraham was raised in darkness. He was a Gentile idolater who eventually awakened to the truth of the one supreme God, abandoned his false deities, and was called by God to leave his homeland.
Which makes him the perfect model.
Exactly. I mean, yes, for a first-century Jewish missionary attempting to persuade Gentiles to convert, Abraham represents the absolute standard of nobility. The philosopher Philo puts it perfectly. He calls Abraham the paradigm for all foreigners who abandon the monstrous customs of assigning divine honors to wood and stones, and who come to settle in a commonwealth full of true life and vitality.
The narrative of Abraham's life presents a severe chronological friction, though.
What is the friction?
Well, God calls Abraham in Genesis 12 when he is 75 years old, but the physical requirement of circumcision doesn't arrive until Genesis 17 when Abraham is 99 years old. Why let him walk around uncircumcised for a quarter of a century? Why the massive delay?
That 24-year delay was heavily analyzed by early Jewish thinkers trying to understand the mechanics of conversion. A fascinating interpretation is preserved in the Makilta de Rabbi Ishmael, an early rabbinic commentary.
What do they say?
It argues that God waiting until Abraham was 99 was a deliberate act of divine forbearance. The rabbis argue that if God had circumcised Abraham at age 20 or 30, then future Gentiles who wanted to convert in their old age might look at the text and think, "I am past that age limit. I am too old to convert."
Oh, that is brilliant.
By waiting until Abraham was physically ancient, God ensured that no Gentile could ever claim the door was closed to them because of their advanced age.
God leaves the door permanently propped open. Abraham undergoes this procedure practically on his deathbed to prove that it is never too late for anyone. He becomes the literal father of proselytes.
According to this reading, Genesis 17 provides the explicit legal and physical mechanism through which non-Israelites can become part of the covenant community.
So the pitch is pretty straightforward.
It is. If you are a Gentile who has abandoned your idols, just as Abraham did in Genesis 12, then the next logical, scripturally mandated step is to follow Abraham's example in Genesis 17 and undergo circumcision to receive the full covenantal blessing.
I have to ask a practical, historical question regarding this strategy. To a modern listener, the idea of traveling around the Mediterranean basin, walking into Greek and Roman cities, and trying to convince grown men to undergo adult circumcision sounds like an impossible marketing campaign.
It sounds incredibly difficult, yes.
There is no anesthesia. The risk of infection is immense. And culturally, Greeks and Romans highly valued the unblemished human form. Circumcision was often viewed by outsiders as bodily mutilation. How did these teachers actually persuade people to do this?
They bypassed the physical trauma by appealing to a major philosophical obsession of the Greco-Roman world. If you read the prominent philosophers of the time, there was a massive cultural focus on the concept of mastering human passions and desires.
Self-mastery.
Right. The ultimate goal of a virtuous life was achieving total self-mastery. The passions were seen as chaotic forces that needed to be tamed. Many Jewish thinkers engaged with this culture by positing that the Jewish law was the ultimate, divinely ordained therapy for human desire. It was the highest possible discipline for cultivating virtue.
So they framed the law not as a burdensome set of arbitrary rules, but as a medical or philosophical cure for the human condition.
Yes, and circumcision specifically was viewed as a physical manifestation of this discipline. Philo makes this argument explicitly, relying on a common philosophical belief found as early as Plato.
What was the belief?
The prevailing thought was that the genital organs were the absolute seat of human passion, that they were inherently disobedient, self-willed, and dominated by frenzied lusts. Philo argues that circumcision is the physical symbol of the excision of excessive and superfluous pleasure. By deliberately cutting the organ that ministers to the strongest of human pleasures, a man publicly and physically achieves mastery over all other forms of chaotic desire.
That completely reframes the practice for a Greek audience. It is not presented as an arbitrary tribal marker. It is presented as a minor surgical procedure necessary for moral perfection.
Hold on.
I am recalling the analogy Thiessen cites from Rabbi Levi in Genesis Rabbah, which perfectly encapsulates how this was pitched. God tells Abraham in Genesis 17 to walk before me and be whole or be complete.
Yeah, that analogy is fantastic.
Rabbi Levi compares this interaction to a king talking to a noble lady. The king looks at the noble lady and tells her she is absolutely perfect. She has no defects whatsoever except for the nail of her little finger, which is slightly too long. He says, pare it, clip it, and the defect will be gone.
Just a tiny clip.
Right. Rabbi Levi says God was telling Abraham the exact same thing. You have no other defect but this foreskin. Remove it, and the defect will be gone.
It is a stunning piece of rhetorical persuasion. Circumcision is framed not as a massive traumatic bodily alteration, but as a minor clipping a final, tiny adjustment needed to achieve total moral perfection.
If Paul's opponents in Galatia were utilizing this kind of sophisticated argumentation, pointing to Abraham as the historical precedent, pointing to the philosophical benefits of self-mastery, and downplaying the physical burden by comparing it to clipping a fingernail, you can easily see why their message would have been incredibly persuasive to Gentile converts.
Very persuasive. They were offering a scripturally backed, historically validated, and philosophically appealing path to becoming full, naturalized citizens of the covenant community.
If this therapy of desire was so highly effective, and the Abrahamic model was so persuasive, did first-century Judaism run organized, aggressive missionary campaigns? Were there structured groups of Jewish teachers systematically traveling the globe trying to convert Gentiles the way Paul and his opponents were clearly doing?
This is a point of significant friction among historians. The historical evidence is pretty mixed, and scholars fall on both sides of the debate.
So we do not really know for sure.
Some scholars maintain that Judaism actively and enthusiastically sought out converts across the empire. Others argue that while Jewish communities were generally open to accepting converts who approached them, they did not actively recruit or proselytize. It is debated whether there was anything akin to a modern, structured missionary movement prior to the Jesus movement spreading across the Mediterranean.
We know conversion occurred, but the mechanisms behind it seem decentralized. Can you provide a historical example of how this debate played out in real time?
The clearest, most dramatic example comes from the Jewish historian Josephus, who records the story of the conversion of King Izates.
King Izates, who was he?
He was the ruler of Adiabene in the early 1st century. Izates is instructed in Jewish customs by a Jewish merchant named Ananias. But Ananias actively dissuades the king from undergoing circumcision. Yes, he tells the king that circumcision is entirely unnecessary for a right relationship with God. Ananias' teaching perfectly fits the pattern we discussed earlier of ethical monotheism, or perhaps sympathization. He's basically telling the king, you can worship the God of Israel and keep the ethical customs without physically altering your body or your identity.
Ananias is offering him solution 1 or 2. You can stay a Gentile king, avoid the political fallout of mutilating your body, and still be right with the divine.
But the narrative shifts violently.
Yeah.
Later, another Jewish teacher arrives at the court, a Galilean named Eleazar. Josephus describes Eleazar as a man who was exceedingly strict and precise regarding the ancestral customs of the Jews.
Uh-oh.
Eleazar walks in, finds King Azadias reading the law of Moses, and severely chastises him. He tells the king that reading the law without obeying the specific commandment of circumcision is a massive offense against God.
Wow.
Under this intense theological pressure, Azadias immediately summons a surgeon and undergoes circumcision to become a genuine Jew.
So Eleazar is aggressively pushing solution 4, conversion. And based on Josephus's description of Eleazar being precise regarding ancestral customs, historians generally identify him as belonging to the party of the Pharisees.
The terminology Josephus uses there is strongly associated with the Pharisees, and this aligns perfectly with other evidence we have linking the Pharisaic movement to an intense openness toward, and perhaps advocacy for, conversion.
Like what other evidence?
The Gospel of Matthew features Jesus issuing a woe against the scribes and Pharisees, stating that they cross sea and land to make one proselyte. The book of Acts portrays some Pharisees who had become believers in Jesus standing up at the Jerusalem Council and demanding that Gentile believers must be circumcised and instructed to keep the law of Moses.
We also have those incredible stories in the Talmud regarding Hillel and Shammai, two of the most famous Pharisaic leaders operating right around the time of Jesus. Those stories perfectly illustrate the internal friction regarding conversion even within the Pharisaic movement itself.
The Talmud records a series of incidents where Gentiles approach both Shammai and Hillel asking to undergo conversion. In the most famous story, a Gentile comes to Shammai and says he is willing to become a proselyte, but only on the condition that Shammai teaches him the entire Torah while standing on one foot.
That is an incredibly arrogant, almost mocking request from the Gentile. He is essentially saying, distill the infinite wisdom of the divine into a soundbite while you perform a balancing act for me.
It is very arrogant.
And Shammai, who is known for his uncompromising strictness, reacts precisely how you would expect a serious scholar to react. He chases the man out of the building with a builder's ruler that he happens to be holding.
This is a very vivid image.
Yeah.
But the narrative continues.
Yeah.
That same Gentile goes to Hillel with the exact same mocking request. Hillel accepts the challenge. He stands on one foot and delivers a stunning summary of the law.
What does he say?
He says, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor." That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and study.
Hillel patiently welcomes the man into the community despite his initial arrogance. So we have two very different reactions.
Yes. We can interpret Shammai's violent rejection in a couple of ways. Perhaps he believed in the theology of conversion, but simply lacked patience for arrogant seekers. Or perhaps Shammai represents a stream of thought within Judaism that was suspicious of, or entirely hostile to, the idea that Gentiles could ever truly become Jews. However, the editors of the Talmud clearly side with Hillel's approach. Gentiles can convert, and they should be graciously welcomed into the fold.
Yet, even when a Gentile was graciously welcomed by someone like Hillel and legally converted, the transition was not always smooth. There was this lingering, persistent social and genealogical friction that the law could not easily erase.
This is a vital point regarding ancient identity. Even when conversion was legally recognized, when it was halakhically valid, the social realities on the ground were incredibly complicated.
How bad did the social friction get?
Well, the Tosefta Baba Metzia, an early rabbinic text, explicitly warns born Jews not to taunt converts. It dictates that if you see a proselyte coming to study the Torah, you must not say to him, "Look who is coming to study Torah, this one who used to eat carrion and creeping things."
The mere fact that they had to codify a rule against saying that tells you that people were absolutely doing it.
Oh, without a doubt.
They were weaponizing the convert's past diet as a way to undermine their current status.
They weaponized it because the core tension stems from the fact that Jewishness was fundamentally genealogical. It was a matter of kinship, ancestry, and bloodlines. A convert changed their legal status, they changed their religious practice, and they altered their physical body.
But could they truly claim the ancient patriarchs as their own flesh and blood?
That is the question. Could someone whose direct ancestors were idol-worshipping outsiders genuinely stand up and pray to the God of our fathers? That underlying anxiety about identity and bloodlines never fully dissipated. The ontological gap was difficult to bridge completely.
That precise genealogical anxiety brings us directly to the doorstep of the Apostle Paul, because this is the exact theological crisis he is wrestling with in his letters.
Yes, it all leads to Paul.
We know Paul used to be a Pharisee. We know from his own writings, like Galatians 5:11, that he used to preach circumcision. He used to actively advocate for the Gentile conversion model. But then, after his encounter with Christ on the road to Damascus, he abruptly stops. He entirely abandons the pro-circumcision message. Why the radical shift?
The answer, according to Thiessen, lies in the intense misunderstanding of a single Greek word, Judaismos.
Judaismos.
This linguistic detail is the absolute turning point of the entire historical analysis. In Galatians chapter 1, Paul is defending his new message to the churches, and he references his past life. Most standard English Bibles translate the verse along these lines. You have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age.
The traditional reading of that translation assumes Paul is saying he abandoned the Jewish religion for a brand new religion called Christianity. He left Judaism behind to start something else.
But Thiessen, building on the rigorous philological work of scholars like Steve Mason and Shea J.D. Cohen, argues that translating Iudismos as Judaism is a massive historical anachronism.
Why is it an anachronism?
It forces a modern post-Enlightenment concept of distinct world religions onto an ancient text that predates that concept by centuries. The noun Iudismos is actually incredibly rare in ancient Greek literature, and it is tied grammatically to the Greek verb iudesin, which translates literally to Judaize.
We need to look closely at how these specific verbs functioned in ancient Greek, because understanding the mechanics of this grammar changes everything about how we read Paul's letters.
In ancient Greek grammar, when you have a verb ending in the suffix asin that is attached to a specific ethnic group, it describes the act of adopting the customs of that group when you do not actually belong to it.
Oh, so it is about imitating.
Right. It refers strictly to behavioral imitation, not an essential change of identity. For example, people born in Media do not Medanize. Only Greeks who adopt Median customs Medize.
Yeah.
Spartans do not Lycanize. Only non-Spartans who start acting like Spartans Lycanize.
Let me build an analogy for this, because the psychological dissonance here is crucial. Imagine a guy born and raised in London. He has a British passport, a British accent, and he has lived in the UK his entire life. One day, he decides he absolutely loves the culture of Texas.
Okay, a London Texan.
Yeah, he buys a pair of expensive leather cowboy boots, he purchases a 10-gallon hat, he starts saying y'all with a highly practiced fake Southern drawl, and he tells everyone he meets that he is a Texan. He is adopting the customs of a group he fundamentally does not belong to.
He is imitating.
He is behaviorally imitating a Texan, but his essential identity, his citizenship, and his actual origin have not changed one bit.
That analogy perfectly captures the dynamic. And importantly, as Cohen notes in his research, these Eisen verbs generally carried a negative, comic, or openly mocking valence in the ancient world.
Because you look ridiculous doing it.
Right. They implied that a person was acting contrary to their true nature. They were seen as a poseur. It is not inherently bad to be a Mede, but it is considered shameful and ridiculous for a Greek to act like a Mede. In the exact same way, using the word Judaizing implies that a person is pretending to be a Jew, acting like a Jew, putting on the cultural clothes of a Jew, but not actually becoming a Jew.
The verb highlights the massive discrepancy between the exterior behavior being performed and the interior reality of the person.
Yes.
We see this specific word used exactly this way in other ancient texts to describe people faking it, don't we?
We do. In the Greek translation of the Book of Esther, after the Jewish people are saved from Haman's plot and the tables are turned on their enemies, the text says that many Gentiles in the Persian Empire Judaized out of fear of the Jews.
So they were scared.
Very scared. The original Hebrew text uses a form that strongly implies they were pretending to be Jews to avoid being slaughtered. They were passing as Jews to survive. The historian Josephus also uses the word in his comprehensive history of the Jewish war. He talks about Syrians Judaizing to avoid violence during a time of intense conflict.
That is just basic survival instinct.
In another incredible, desperate story, Josephus writes about a Roman commander named Metilius. Metilius' garrison is being massacred in Jerusalem by Jewish rebels. Metilius begs for his life, promising the rebels that if they spare him, he will Judaize up to the point of circumcision.
Metilius is essentially saying, I will adopt all your customs, I will wear the clothes, I will even undergo the agonizing surgery, just do not kill me. He is not experiencing a genuine theological awakening. He is desperately trying to survive by adopting the external physical markers of the group currently holding the swords.
Precisely. Now, for some Jewish thinkers, going all the way to the point of circumcision was considered full, valid conversion. But for others, especially in light of the genealogical anxiety we discussed earlier, even circumcision was viewed as just the ultimate form of Judaizing,
It was a Gentile putting on a very convincing, permanent costume.
but remaining fundamentally a Gentile underneath the ritual. And this is how Paul utilizes the verb in his own writing.
We see this clearly in Galatians 2. Paul recounts his famous, highly public confrontation with the Apostle Peter in the city of Antioch. Peter had been eating meals with the uncircumcised Gentile believers, fully accepting them. But when some strict Jewish believers arrived from Jerusalem, Peter panicked.
He got intimidated by the strict group.
Right. He pulled back and separated himself from the Gentiles to appease them. And Paul calls him out publicly. Paul says to Peter, "If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to Judaize?"
That single verse is the interpretive key to the entire letter. Paul uses the verb iudesign negatively. Paul realizes a major symmetry here. Just as Peter acting like a Gentile for an afternoon does not actually make Peter a Gentile acting like a Jew does not make them a Jew.
It is all just outward behavior.
A Gentile undergoing circumcision, keeping the Sabbath, and eating kosher food is just iudesign. It is play acting. It is behavioral imitation that cannot bridge the genealogical gap.
So when Paul talks in Galatians 1 about his former life in iudismos, he is not saying, "I used to practice the Jewish religion and now I practice the Christian religion."
No.
He is saying, "I used to be fiercely, violently dedicated to the project of forcing Gentiles to Judaize. He used to be the guy demanding that the Londoner put on the cowboy boots and the hat and pretend to be a Texan."
Yes. Paul absolutely did not abandon his Jewish identity. Throughout his letters, he repeatedly and proudly calls himself a Hebrew, an Israelite of the tribe of Benjamin. What he abandoned was his former missionary strategy regarding outsiders.
The Damascus Road encounter completely shifted his view on this.
His encounter with Christ caused an absolute paradigm shift in his theology. He realized that the Jewish law did not actually solve the Gentile problem at all. Having Gentiles undergo circumcision and adopt dietary laws did not alter their fundamental genealogical identity as outsiders.
It was just an external behavior modification.
They were still Gentiles, still trapped in the profane seed, just attempting to pass as holy seed.
They were just dressing up. And Paul is arguing that the Christ event demands a solution much more radical than a cultural costume change. The opponents in Galatia are pushing solution for conversion, modeled heavily on the story of Abraham and the therapy of desire. But Paul has realized that solution 4 is structurally flawed because it relies entirely on iudaismos, on imitation.
When we strip away the long-standing and anachronistic assumptions about Paul fighting some generic form of legalism, we see a much more rigorous, historically grounded intellectual debate occurring in these texts.
So he is not fighting a monolithic, irrational enemy.
No, he is engaging directly with a historically valid, scripturally supported, highly persuasive option for how outsiders relate to the divine. He just believes that in light of the revelation of Jesus, that specific option is no longer the correct one. The Gentile problem, the alienation of the nations from God, is solved through Christ, not through adopting the external customs of the Mosaic law.
That is a staggering shift in perspective. To summarize all these massive historical and theological threads we have pulled today, First century Judaism was not a single closed-off fortress with one door. It was an incredibly diverse intellectual landscape.
Very diverse.
It offered multiple avenues for outsiders to relate to God, from sympathizing from a distance and funding the temple to following a universal moral baseline like the Noahide laws.
Or waiting for an end times purification where wolves become white bulls.
Right. Or full physical conversion and integration. Paul's opponents in Galatia were offering one of these historically valid, scripturally backed options using the Abrahamic model. But Paul, understanding the linguistic reality and the theological limits of Judaizing, rejected the idea that Gentiles should play dress-up to access the covenant.
The value of understanding this specific historical context is massive for how we read ancient texts. When you strip away the monolithic stereotypes of the opponents, when you stop treating them as generic bad guys designed just to make the hero look good, it allows you to see the actual rigorous intellectual debates happening in the ancient world.
It really breathes life into the letters.
It shows us that these were real people dealing with complicated social and theological questions, using their ancient scriptures to find logical, workable solutions to the problem of human division.
It makes the history so much more human. It grounds it in reality. And it leaves us with a challenging thought to ponder long after the audio stops today.
What is that?
Well, if Paul concluded that adopting the external customs of another group was basically play acting rather than a true shift in identity, how does that challenge the way we construct our own ideological identities today?
Oh, that is a great question.
When we adopt a new belief system or join a new community, are we undergoing a true internal shift in who we are, or are we just trying on a new set of cultural clothes to fit in with the locals?
That is certainly a thought worth considering.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We will catch you next time.